Hello, everybody. Welcome to the program of American Space Almaty. The talk is today for philosophical talks with Steven Friedman, a great philosopher who was admired by professors in Harvard and the University of California in Los Angeles. Mr. Steven Friedman, today we will have a very interesting topic and talk, so stay tuned. Please be engaged and ask your questions, leave comments, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts in our comments. Welcome, Mr. Friedman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate the introduction. I again want to thank everybody associated with the American Consulate in Almaty, Tracy, Kimbut, Consul General Eric Meyer, and others that have made this series of talks possible. I very much appreciate the platform and the opportunity to convey philosophical perspectives on a wide variety of issues. So the main topic for tonight is global makers. And as usual, I tend to veer from the topic to give broader philosophical perspectives on whatever the particular issue happens to be. Global makers in particular deals with the question of how small acts, individual acts, can contribute to the solution to major problems, global problems. It's the first thing that came to my mind, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the process always by which ideas come together, coalesce when I see like a topic, because I think it helps bring to life the philosophical process that is sometimes obscured when just the results, just the final series of ideas is presented in some sequence. The first thing that came to mind was furniture. And I was thinking of subtitling the talk, The Philosophy of Furniture. And in fact, that was my initial proposal. Even though it was a little obscure, it seemed provocative, right? Interesting, intriguing. Well, it turns out that furniture plays a prominent role in philosophy, in the history of the subject. And the fact that it does illustrates some important aspects of philosophy itself. We think of philosophy as a very abstract, undertaking, something that's trying to see the world, in its totality from a great distance, trying to achieve perspective and trying to achieve results and formulate results in language that's often challenging, difficult. And philosophers are striving for a certain degree of precision, of rigor, and that's often challenging, for anyone, including other philosophers, to come to terms with. But in actuality, philosophy is, even though it has a tendency to express itself abstractly and to aim for expressions, formulations that summarize a great deal of experience, nevertheless, it's focused upon the most concrete aspects of our experience because it needs to explain everything. And what it most needs to explain is what's always right in front of our eyes. That if we can understand a chair or a table, then we can in principle understand the nature of objects, the nature of existing things. And that would apply in principle to all existing things, or at least the insights that we would have relative to a chair or a table might also give insight into the nature of galaxies, the nature of stars, the nature of ourselves. Okay? So furniture, because it's present, because it's concrete, and because it's functional, it has a lot of different dimensions to it, is often the subject of philosophical writing and inquiry and pursuits. Well, there's even, in fact, a famous remark that Wittgenstein, the, again, great 20th century philosopher, that's probably the most important single influence upon my philosophical results, made. Now, Wittgenstein was very concerned with the nature of language, the nature of meaning, how words mean, the nature of concepts, how concepts mean, how they function, in our world, and in particular, how they make social structures possible, how they make what Wittgenstein termed a form of life possible. Well, Wittgenstein once made the remark it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of language, of the nature of words, of the nature of concepts, to think that we can understand the concept of a chair by staring at a chair. Okay? That, in other words, the meaning of a word is not the object for which the word stands, but it's how that word is used in a broader context of human life, of social interaction, what we do with that word in relation to the object. So, not that we're going to be talking about Wittgenstein, I just want to show you that even at the level of one of the greatest of all philosophers, furniture, important. Okay, well, the reason that furniture came to mind in relation to the global maker topic is, and it's something that I did make reference to in an earlier lecture, our sense of objects, our sense of physical objects, our sense of a chair is that it's made of component parts. Now, historically, objects have always been seen as made of component parts in the sense that they're typically fabric, or objects like furniture is fabricated. It's brought together from individual, pieces of wood or glass or metal, whatever the components happen to be, out of which the chair is being made. But more theoretically, more scientifically, these days, we think of chairs and other physical objects as made of atoms, molecules, subatomic particles, things that are too small for us to see, without special instrumentation, special microscopes, electron microscopes, things that are able to achieve levels of magnification unimaginable in earlier generations. And we understand that a chair, a table, is made up of untold numbers of such individual component parts. Okay? So the question arises, what we'd like to address, and again, it's often said that philosophy and almost every area of intellectual inquiry is motivated, ultimately stimulated by the questions that somebody asks. I talked one time also, and I'll get back to the chair in a second, of Darwin's theory of evolution as one of the most compelling of all theories, and a theory that is so important in the understanding of all biological phenomena that I've always encouraged people that have any doubt about both the power and the place of the theory, the degree to which we want to entertain the theory, to use it, to read Darwin's original work on the origin of species, where the evidence that he gives for that theory is overwhelming. Well, that theory was, according to some accounts, largely motivated at the beginning of Darwin's career by the question Darwin asked himself: why are there no rabbits in South America? Often the question that begins a process of investigation is something that bears very little relationship seemingly to the final result, but is helpful in explaining the nature of that final result and what ultimately brought it about. Okay? Well, a question to ask about a chair is, why the chair in front of me or any piece of furniture that you might have around at the moment is sitting where it is relatively stationary. Now, it turns out that one way to address that question is in terms of the behavior of the individual particles making it up. When we talk about the behavior of the particles making it up, we're talking about a branch of science called thermodynamics that was developed in the 19th century and was actually the branch of physics that most impressed Einstein when he was a young man. He felt that thermodynamics was the one branch of science that would still remain standing at the end of time, no matter what other discoveries were made and what other changes in our understanding of the world might come about. He felt it was that fundamental. Well, and interesting too, is the person that was probably majorly responsible for the development of thermodynamics and this interpretation of it in terms of the behavior of the individual component parts of an object, the molecules, the atoms, was a man named Boltzmann, a physicist who lived at the end of the 19th century, whose work was not appreciated in his lifetime. Actually, a lot of the developers of thermodynamics were not appreciated in their lifetime. And interestingly, Wittgenstein, the philosopher, was on his way to work with the physicist Boltzmann when news came to the young Wittgenstein that Boltzmann had committed suicide, had hanged himself in his backyard because of his frustration with not having his results appreciated, understood. It's a, unfortunately common theme, right, in the history of thought, that profoundly significant results take time to be understood, to be appreciated. Well, okay, so chair. Why is this chair sitting where it is? Well, the way we approach that is to imagine what would happen if all of the atoms, all of the molecules, all of the component parts were not in random motion in different directions as we imagine them to be. But if they all lined up in one direction, even though it's unlikely for that to happen, it's not theoretically impossible for it to happen. Well, if suddenly all the atoms, all the molecules, all the subatomic component parts of this chair were, let's say, aligned, and for an instant moving in the same direction, let's say moving up in the same direction for an instant, that chair would rocket into space. Okay? So the significance of that is the power of concerted action, right? This chair is sitting where it is motionless because all of its component parts are moving in different directions. Were they all to somehow be aligned, then it could move in any direction without bound, okay? Well, it's not clear how we would ever be able to align its atoms or its molecules, and that's why objects have relative stability in our environment. They're not randomly doing things that defy expectation, even though theoretically they could. And notice, the science of thermodynamics does not say it's impossible for this chair to immediately go up into space without expectation, right? It just says it's unlikely, right? In the same way that philosophy says, past can't guarantee the future, right? Just logically cannot guarantee it. So the fact that this chair has not yet rocketed into space doesn't mean in the next instant it won't. And to show a convergence of ideas, if you believe in a God, you believe in some controlling power or intelligence, to all of existence, well, that God certainly has the power to decide the course of future events. And so even if you believe in a God, there's no guarantee that that chair in the next instant won't, again, rocket into space because God has decided it's in the best interest of that chair to do so. Okay? So we, again, think that the past controls the future, but from a scientific standpoint, a philosophical standpoint, a religious standpoint, no. Okay? Well, but the discussion of the chair is really a metaphor, right? For actions that human beings can undertake to achieve a given result, a collective result, right? The kind of results that global makers have in mind. In other words, let's say we want to achieve a given goal that we can identify as desirable for whatever reason. Now, philosophy doesn't dictate the nature of the goal, but it will talk about the means to achieve that goal. And the means to achieve any goal is through some degree of what I call convergence, some number of elements that are aligned, that are coming together, that are moving in the same direction. So, for example, we've had a series of talks so far that have touched upon the issue of the pandemic, right? COVID pandemic. Well, one way to achieve the goal of the eradication of the pandemic is if everyone aligned, everyone agreed to wear masks and social distance no matter what the circumstances. If everybody, when they stepped out of their home, their apartment, their dwelling, put on a mask and retained it, while they were outside and rigorously maintained a distance from others, in principle, that's going to make it very hard for the virus to thrive in a human population. And within a matter of weeks, in principle, the virus can be more or less stopped. But it demands coordinated action if we want that result. And the fact that, like, even in Los Angeles, the United States, from what I hear, maybe 50% of people are wearing masks, but maybe not quite consistently or religiously, and 50% are not wearing them mostly or much at all. Well, that's as if the atoms and the molecules in this chair were not sufficiently aligned to produce significant movement in a given direction towards a given goal. Okay? So ultimately, the achievement of broad goals is a numbers game. The more numbers we can bring together to achieve a certain goal, the more likely that goal is to be achieved, the more rapidly it's likely to be achieved. That's the nature of any process. How I talk about it philosophically is that's the nature of the creation of any object, where an object can be a chair or a table, something that we assemble out of parts, or it can be a goal that we want to achieve. It can be a goal of becoming a bodybuilder, and competing, in bodybuilding competitions. The more we aspire to that goal, the more weight we're going to lift, the more repetitions we're going to do. And that again brings us to a comment that I've made previously, this notion of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is insanity. No, it's training. When we're in the gym, we're basically doing the same thing over and over again. We're lifting weights, or we're lifting progressively, heavier weights, but still we're doing lots of repetitions. And those repetitions are adding up to a new result, right? It turns out in this world, you can't do the same thing repeatedly. Every time you do something, it's different simply because it's the next time you've done it, right? And the third time is different from the second time because it's the third. And the background, the history of that process is now different. It has one more instance, one more repetition. And at some point, I gave an example of a short story by Václav Havel, the first president of the Czech Republic, who wrote about a young boy who bangs his head against a wall. Everyone thinks him mad. One day, the wall comes down, right? That's the nature of concerted action. It's the nature of that action if it's undertaken by an individual. It's the nature of achieving a goal undertaken by a group, okay? Now, last week I was talking about mental health, and I ran out of time, and I wanted to address something about this issue of all things coming together to produce a significant result. Again, the idea behind, global makers, lots of individual things coming together. And I just briefly wanted to go back to what I was saying in terms of psychiatry, not aspiring to solve human problems, but just aspiring to bring people to a state of normality, freeing them from issues, concerns, burdens that prevent them from leading a normal life. That if somebody is reacting extremely, abnormally, excessively to something that is not a normal threat to human beings, well, psychiatry, medicine can attend to that. But if it's a matter of dealing with something extreme, if it's a matter of dealing with a pandemic, if it's a matter of dealing with an extreme disease condition, if it's a matter of dealing with being tortured to death, something that religions do address, well, psychiatry has nothing to say. It's an extreme condition. A human being in an extreme condition being tortured to death would be expected to be unhappy. Yes. But religions aspire to something more extreme in terms of a solution, right? One of the points I've made is that Christianity has partly achieved the prominence historically that it has because it doesn't avoid that type of extreme issue. In fact, people wear it as an emblem, as a symbol. The cross, the symbol of Christianity, is the symbol of a man being tortured to death. And in fact, Buddhists, when they first encountered Christians, were astonished. They didn't understand. Why would they worship a man being tortured? In Buddhism, Buddhists want to end human suffering, not embrace it or celebrate it. They want to bring it to an end. Well, Christianity also wants to bring it to an end or have a response to it. But from the Christian perspective, confronting it in the way that Christianity does is their approach to achieving a complete solution, a solution strong enough to address the worst of human experience, the worst of human suffering. Well, I mentioned also that Buddhism, in its interest in ending disease, old age, and death, which Siddhartha Gautama undertook to end, was not able to go into a laboratory, right, and find a technological solution to those issues. As we, again, as in terms of like global making, we might think in terms of technological solutions to problems. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. There was no technology available at anything close to the level to achieve a cure for everything in a laboratory 2,500 years ago. We, with all of our laboratories, struggle to advance the cures of diseases. We still are able to diagnose diseases much more than we're able to cure. So that was not the approach of the Buddha. The approach of the Buddha to end disease, old age, and death was to end the concepts. I was talking about that last time. And I developed the Buddhist response as in the nature of a little logical argument, right? And again, I recommend you can watch last week's talk. I don't want to go into all the details that I developed, because then we would have time to go into the new material. But just briefly, the Buddhist response, the Buddhist way to end the concepts disease, old age, and death was through an analysis that to be real is to persist. Dreams are not real because they don't last. Okay? Then the Buddha, under the Bodhi tree, at the moment of enlightenment, had a vision that nothing lasts. Not God, not elementary particles, not the laws of physics, not anything. And so the Buddhist logic, the real lasts, nothing lasts, therefore nothing is real, including disease, old age, and death. They're not what we think. They're fundamentally different. They don't have the reality. And that frees us from those concepts as we normally understand them. Okay? The only problem with that is it's based upon a belief that nothing lasts. We can't know that. So Buddhism is a religion. It's not rigorous philosophy. But it shows us an approach to solving problems that's not a technological approach, but a matter of a certain type of understanding, right? A certain type of analysis of concepts, right? And that can apply to lots of problems in the world. Technology is, the point being, not the only solution. And we should keep that in mind when we're thinking in terms of global solutions to problems. In fact, Steve Jobs once famously remarked, "I would trade all my technology for an afternoon with Socrates." I mean, even Steve Jobs knew that for all of its power, there might be greater power in a more conceptual, a more philosophical approach. Okay, so let's not put all of our focus upon technological possibilities. There are others. Well, one of those others is to getting rid of the concepts that we are burdened by: disease, old age, death, whatever. And those are, for Buddhism, they represent the worst of human experience. So if we can get rid of those, we can probably deal with a headache, right? Okay. So another approach from a different direction is the theistic approach, the approach of people that embrace the concept of a God. And that represents like the Judeo, Jewish, Christian, Islamic tradition, the concept of a single God, a monotheism, one God. And even within Hinduism, there's that aspect as well, embraced by some segments of the population. Well, I dealt with this briefly last time before I ran out of time. When, for the concept of God, that is actually what we might call philosophically a concept of universal convergence. All things come together in God. All things become one in God. God is the source, and God is the ultimate reference of everything. Well, when all things become one thing, distinctions between those things disappear. For example, the way I sometimes illustrate the concept is, imagine all the objects in this room, in any environment, becoming exactly the same color, exactly the same tone, so that we lose contrast between objects. We see, our mind, our brain processes visual information primarily in terms of contrast. And that goes back really to, if, again, one subscribes to evolutionary theory, which, again, I find the most powerful explainer of biological phenomena. according to evolutionary theory, descended from trees, not from chimpanzees, but from some common ancestor to forms like the chimpanzee. We're very closely related in terms of our genes, our genetics, to the chimpanzee. I think about 98% of our genes are shared with chimpanzees. That's a lot of, that's close genetic relationship. Well, if you are living in trees, it's essential for survival to see in high contrast, because you have to see the branch against the space around it. The branch is life, the space around it, potentially death. So we want to be able to see in strong contrast, to see the object that can support us. Well, the I forgot the okay the so for the first time I've lost my place. It's awkward. Okay, but let me think. Well, okay, so we need to, I think, okay. Well, okay, so we see in strong contrast, in order to appreciate our circumstances, hold on one second. Okay. Okay, let me go back. So we're looking for concerted action to achieve specific results. The results that we want, the more that we are able to bring together, a concerted action, the more we're able to achieve a strong outcome, we're able to achieve a goal. Okay, sorry. So when all things come together in one thing and we don't see any longer distinctions, contrasts between objects. Well, again, if this room became a single color, a single tone, we wouldn't distinguish individual components, individual objects. All of the objects would become one, and our concepts of the individual objects would vanish. When all things become one thing, concepts which are meant to group things and to group things in contrast, in distinction to other things, ceases. So all things becoming one thing achieves the same kind of stripping the world of concepts that Buddhism achieves through that logic. Okay? So you see now this is at the extreme limit of theistic belief in God, where we talk of mystical union with God, becoming one with God. When all things become one in God, all concepts disappear, including concepts like disease, old age, and death. So the theistic logic, the logic of belief in a concept of God, is actually achieving the same elimination of concepts that Buddhism was striving for as a solution to the problem of mortality, disease, old age, and death. Well, Philosophy is able to achieve the same result, but from a different direction. Then philosophy's approach is a little bit stronger because any two things in our experience conceptually are approximately the same, but rigorously different. If they weren't different in any way, they would become the same thing. If we were not different in some way from every other person, every other existing thing, even if only in location, then there wouldn't be two things that we'd be talking about. There'd be only one. So philosophy, actually, the process of someone who believes in a God, of all things becoming one thing, that's kind of an intellectual leap. You have to sort of imagine that it's not something that is rigorously so, because rigor deals with distinctions between things. That insofar as two things are not one, then anything you say about one thing does not necessarily apply rigorously to the other. So a philosophic space, the way philosophy sees the world ultimately, is in terms of any two things being rigorously different, which means that ultimately any two things cannot be grouped together, which is what concepts are doing. So a rigorous philosophical space where any two things are recognized as fundamentally, ultimately different is also a space that escapes conceptualization. And the upshot of that is that a concept like disease or old age or death need not apply to you simply because it's applied to every other human being, because of whatever constitutes a difference between you and every other human being. So it achieves the same type of result. So you might ask, well, so that means we're not necessarily going to die? And the answer is yes. Rigorously, you're not necessarily going to be able to die. How could you know? Just because other human beings have died, that's not rigorously enough to assert in your case. Just because everyone up till now has died doesn't mean that from this point forward, death will be part of the human condition. You can assume it, you can live in terms of it. That's living in what I call a heuristic space, where you're using the past as a guide to the future. It can be used as a guide. It can be used especially as a guide when we're creating things, when we're building computers or whatever kind of object or device we might be building. But rigorously, the past can't guarantee the future. The future hasn't happened yet. And it can, in principle, take any possible form. Now you say to me, well, am I going to live in that kind of rigorous space? And the answer is, you better. Or another way to say it is, that is the space of Eden. That Eden is a space of philosophical rigor. That's the only thing we can absolutely, unquestionably know. That's the basis for the consolation that Socrates put forth in the face of his sentence to death. Right? I've mentioned this previously, that when he's been condemned to death by the Athenian court for corrupting the youth of Athens, he says to his friends, and so we go our separate ways, you to live and I to die. And which is better, only God knows. But we think we know, desperately, erroneously, every moment of our suffocating lives, and suffer. It's really very simple. It's a matter of the nature, the true nature of our circumstances, the rigorous nature, what we can know for sure, not what we think, not what we imagine, not what we think is approximately or likely to be so, but what is rigorously so. And that rigor is really the only type of understanding that would be appropriate to a God. If God is anything, he or she or it is a God of rigor, a God of precision. So philosophy provides the same kind of stripping the world of concepts that a theistic tradition, a belief in God, arrives at, and that Buddhism arrives at, but philosophy is arriving at that position through a rigorous assessment of our circumstances. What we can definitively, absolutely, without question, know. And the way it's sometimes summarized in terms of the relationship to problems that we seek to solve and problems that we feel that we suffer from or suffer the lack of a solution to is one of my aphorisms. Again, an aphorism is a concentrated statement. We suffer not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. Okay? Now, this question of Eden represents a perfect solution. It represents the world at the beginning of time in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, before disease, old age, and death entered the picture. It represents a goal or an aspiration. So if we are interested in achieving global solutions, and we're not dealing just with what is kind of scientifically possible, but we want a complete solution. One way of saying that is we want to bring about a return to Eden, right? That's the extreme that would be our goal, our aspiration. And we see this, and we see the exploration of this in some prominent writers that I wanted to just kind of mention. One that has a special relevance to this issue, the issue of, again, global makers, of the form in which solutions, can be, the form that solutions might present themselves in, and the form that they can be pursued, is Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau was an early 19th century American writer, naturalist. He studied nature, wrote about nature, and philosopher. His most famous work is a work called Walden, W-A-L-D-E-N, Walden. It was written after spending 2 years in relative isolation on a farm in a portion of Massachusetts outside of Boston. It turns out that Thoreau was born in the Northeast, born near Boston. I think he was born in a city called, a small town actually called Concord. He actually went to Harvard. And at Harvard, he lived in a dormitory there at the center of campus called Harvard Yard. It's where freshmen at Harvard will live today. I mean, when there's not a pandemic, freshmen at Harvard will live in the yard. And there are maybe a dozen sort of dormitory type buildings that are mostly old buildings by American standards. Some of them go back to pre-Revolutionary War days. So they were built like in the early 18th century, which is early in the United States. Thoreau lived in one such building, Hollis Hall. Okay? He actually lived in the room Hollis 11 on the 3rd floor of Hollis. Hollis, again, was constructed before the Revolutionary War in the United States, which was in the late 1770s, early 1880s. That's when the Revolutionary War was fought, sort of towards the end of the 18th century. That hall, like other buildings at Harvard at the time, housed American Revolutionary troops. Well, so Thoreau lived in Hollis 11. It turns out that when I went to Harvard, I lived in Hollis 12, right across the hall from where Thoreau had lived. And we actually turned out to have done similar things when we were at the university. He spent his time in the library reading books. I spent my time mostly in the library reading books. And this is something that, again, is kind of serves as a lesson in the context of global making, that I was at a university with distinguished professors, but those professors, as distinguished as they were not quite at the level of the historical figures that I was able to read in the library. And I didn't need to read lots of books. I needed to read a small number of books. The same thing with Thoreau. The same thing with Abraham Lincoln, our greatest president by many people's judgment. If not our greatest president as a political figure, arguably our greatest writer among presidents. Well, Abraham Lincoln had relatively limited means as he grew up, and certainly no technology, right? Abraham Lincoln became the writer that he became by reading basically two sets of works. He read the King James Version of the Bible, which was a version of the Bible that was translated around the time of Shakespeare, during like the early 17th century, when Shakespeare was writing his more mature, his final plays. And Abraham Lincoln read Shakespeare. So basically, two sets of works, the King James Bible, Shakespeare. By focusing on those two works, he was able to become the writer that he did. He didn't need a lot of technology. We don't need necessarily technology. We need maybe a few good books and to give people the ability to read those books, right? Same thing, actually, and I'll get back to Thoreau in a second, happened with Newton. Newton taught himself geometry by reading Euclid's Elements, one book. Euclid's Elements was written by an ancient Greek mathematician about 2,000 years before the time of Newton, before Newton lived, and was the main textbook for studying geometry for over 2,000 years, up until, I think, the late 19th century, when now there are lots of different geometry books. There are probably new geometry books being written every year. I had a high school teacher who wrote a geometry book that I helped assemble for him. You know, I just was like an assistant, you know, in the process. We don't need so many geometry books. We needed Euclid's Elements, one book. That was enough for Newton. And his reading of that book and his assimilating of that book laid the foundation for his work in physics that changed the world and our understanding of the world. Well, in fact, Newton had a very, unpleasant personality. He was not a social individual. There's a story told about him once where he was knighted. He became Sir Isaac Newton for his contributions to science. Well, as a Sir, he was able to serve or attend meetings of the House of Lords, which is one of the divisions of Parliament in England. So he would go to the House of Lords and attend, sit through meetings, discussions, debates in the House of Lords, saying nothing, never said anything. Year after year, said nothing. Until one day, he begins, coughing or drawing attention to himself. I think he might have made a gesture with his hand, and everyone stops. And they look to this great figure who is, at this point, the most famous man in England and maybe in Europe. He's going to speak for the first time, since he's been a member of the House of Lords. And there's a hush. And Newton says, could someone please open the window? That was Newton's utterance. Okay. Well, Newton also supposedly never was noted to have laughed in his life except for one time. And that was when someone came up to him and asked what possible use geometry could be. Well, that for Newton was a hilarious comment because it had been the basis of his work that changed the world. But one book, okay? Not thousands, one. So back to Thoreau. He was interesting in a lot of ways. His father was a pencil maker. Thoreau, in fact, designed a better pencil that became apparently the standard pencil design in the 19th century in the United States. His father, after Thoreau had designed his pencil, encouraged his son to become part of his pencil manufacturing business. And Thoreau said, no, I've designed one pencil, made one pencil, why do we need to make more? That was his sort of relationship. He was interested in the idea, the concept, and then moved on. Well, as I said, Thoreau spent, when he was about 30, he decided to investigate the nature of life as it presented itself in its most basic form, like to investigate what really human needs are. There's a saying, physician, heal thyself. Well, if you want to be a guide, to other human beings, the idea is first solve your own world. First save yourself. Once you've achieved that kind of result, that kind of relationship to experience, then you can become an example to others. But not just by making proclamations or not just by giving instructions, by actually embodying the nature of the solution that you're seeking. Well, Thoreau sought a solution to the problem of human life. And he sought it by, again, simplifying his life, living on a farm, on the corner of a farm, about 2 miles away from anybody else in relative isolation for 2 years. So basically, people these days, we complain, we resist, the isolation that the pandemic has imposed upon us, right? We don't have the degree of social interaction that we did. Well, Thoreau voluntarily withdrew from society for 2 years, and he flourished. And the result of that was this work that was not appreciated in its lifetime. I think he had 1,000 copies of Walden, his book that recounts his experience and the lessons that he learned from it. 1,000 copies, I think he sold a few hundred, still had 700 remaining unsold. He tried to give public talks about his approach to life that he had investigated. He failed. He was not a good public speaker. And a few years later, he died, thinking himself a failure, at least in terms of a public career. But his work survived. And Walden became one of the great works of the 19th century and one of the great American philosophical works. And a work that's been an inspiration for dealing with extreme circumstances and for coming to terms with life on its most basic level, its most basic terms. Remember, a few weeks ago, I was commenting on how when I was very young, like 12, I had an opportunity to go to England because my mother's family was from England, and I leapt at that opportunity. Okay, but a few years later, I began studying philosophy, and I wasn't so interested in traveling to Europe or going back to England. I was more interested in the nature of the color blue. You know, again, the nature of the chair in front of me, the nature of the experience that is going to be the same in its essentials, you know, whether I'm here or on the other side of the world, right? So Thoreau's fundamental takeaway from this experience was simplify, simplify, simplify. That we don't need an abundance. We need to sort of see deeply into our circumstances. That we don't need new objects, new things, more things. What we need is to understand what's just present in our circumstances. That if there is a solution to the world, it's going to be right here, right now, in the form of this wall, this chair, and understanding deeply of what these objects are, what they signify, what our circumstances signify. We don't need, again, to journey vast distances. We need to come to terms with the immediacy of our circumstances. And again, that's at the core of philosophical understanding, because, as I again stressed, the past is uncertain, right? The future can change the form of the past. We can't be sure. You know, we can have a discovery tomorrow or the next day that changes our understanding, our sense of the past. We certainly can't lay any claim to the future, right? That's not, whatever we say about the future can't rise to the level of rigor of something that's incontestable. It hasn't happened yet. So the only thing that can sort of rise to the level of certainty, the level that philosophy demands, is what's present, what's right in front of our eyes. That has to be the portal, okay? Now, you find that also in another work, celebrated by Voltaire, one of the great French writers of the 18th century, part of that intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, which actually represented the assimilation, the adoption, the coming to terms with the scientific revolution that Newton had initiated. It represented sort of an attempt to understand the world more in scientific terms than in religious terms. Voltaire was famously anti-religious, or certainly anti-Catholic, which was the the dominant faith of France, you know, certainly at that time. Voltaire wrote a book called Candide, a relatively short novel, in which he investigates actually the philosophy of Leibniz, a major philosopher, a little bit who lived like the previous century. Leibniz had this view, tried to understand the world in its totality, and he had this view that this was the best of all possible worlds. That's a famous line that you hear when people summarize the philosophy of Leibniz. Well, Candide makes fun of that. You know, Candide, the main character in the novel, goes through a series of horrific circumstances, and the philosopher, his name is Pangloss, that accompanies him, you know, keeps saying, well, regardless, you know, of how it appears, this is the best of all possible worlds. And you know, Voltaire is obviously mocking, making fun of that claim. And the final line of that book is, let us go work in the garden. Let's not deal with trying to understand the world, as it were, from the outside, but let's try to understand the world from our detailed set of circumstances, the garden. And the garden is always a metaphor for Eden. So Eden is the garden, but we can access it through that degree of simplicity of action. It's not a matter of assembling a rocket. It's a matter of understanding something as fundamental as the process of gardening and focusing upon the immediacy of our circumstances. If the solution isn't in our immediate circumstances, it's not anywhere. That's a philosophical, again, position. Well, oh, and I should say too, just as that final line from Voltaire is a famous line, and it summarizes a whole response to our circumstance, the idea that we are going to enter or re-enter Eden, not through traveling to the moon, but through our garden, or understanding this immediate set of circumstances. In a similar way, the final line of Thoreau's Walden is famous. It actually sort of summarizes a couple of the aphorisms that I've given about time, that the past can't guarantee the future decides the past, which means anything is still possible, right? The future can take any possible form. It hasn't happened. We only think it's limited, by what's happened in the past. And there's another aphorism I wrote about that. We wallpaper the future with prints from the past and then marvel at our dissatisfactions. Okay, so I'm giving an analysis of the psychology of why we suffer by being too committed to the past, not understanding that there's no logical claim that the past has on the future. Well, Thoreau's embodiment of that idea in the final line of Walden is, the sun is but a morning star. Anything is still possible. We're still early in this existence. We don't know yet what this is. It can still take any possible form. And the final form that it takes decides the reality. We suffer when we think we know what final form it takes. I've sometimes said that, even when I mentioned earlier, what kind of world is it where we can't know that death is certain, where death is not certain? Well, this kind of world. And I sometimes will say to people, if someone dies and you're suffering their death, what do you know? That they will not return to the end of all time? You know that? You can know that? We cannot know that. Sorry. Okay? But we think we can. And we suffer that presumption. Which now brings us to this idea of Eden. Where is it? How do we get back to it? Again, in terms of, I've already suggested that in terms of like global makers, we might want to embrace more simple solutions, right? We don't need to give everyone a virtual classroom. We need to give them some ability to read and then a few books. Well, the fall from Eden in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition famously involves Adam and Eve eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? They're in this garden, the Garden of Eden. It's a perfect world. There's no death, there's no disease, there's no suffering. Right? It's a perfect state. And Eve reaches, it's not quite clear, for this fruit. Maybe it's an apple, maybe it's another fruit, maybe it's a pear, it's not quite clear. But a fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they've been told not to eat from. Well, And the interpretation in the tradition, and again, this is at the beginning of the Jewish Bible, which is the start also of the Christian tradition, which is also accepted by the Islamic tradition, right? So that whole tradition from Judaism through Christianity to Islam sees the problem of human life that needs to be solved, that we need to be addressing, however we're going to be addressing it, globally, technologically, whatever we're going to be doing, as going back to Adam and Eve's act of disobedience in the garden. And that's how it's interpreted, as an act of disobedience. God says, don't do this. They do it, and God punishes them with disease, old age, death, and human suffering. The problem that then we need to solve, either technologically or conceptually or somehow, right? That everything goes back to that. Well, what's interesting about that is it's seen as an act of disobedience, which means God could have forbidden them to do any number of things, right? He could have forbidden them to turn over a rock, forbidden them to move a plant, uproot a plant. But no, he specifically forbids them to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And almost all commentary that I see on this, and there's been a lot of discussion in all of those traditions about that act that brings human suffering into the world and creates the problems that now we're trying to solve, right? In believing in that tradition. There's a lot of discussion about the act of disobedience, but not about why it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Here's why it's the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. Because to know that something is good or bad, to be able to claim something about the goodness or badness of something, is to make a claim about the nature of that object, the nature of that thing, the nature of that action. But what something is, the nature of that thing depends upon how it plays out in time. The future decides the past. We think something is bad. We think our transformation, our disease is bad. A caterpillar thinks that the process it's going through is horrific, but then it emerges the butterfly. It's the outcome that decides. If one day we awaken to a totally different reality, and that reality is eternal sunshine and blue skies, fresh fields, well, that redeems everything that came before, right? I actually once was having a discussion with a rabbi, a prominent rabbi at a large temple in Los Angeles. I was discussing this problem of human suffering, right, and addressing that problem. And I was telling him about the philosophical response to that problem. And at some point, he asked me the question, he interjects, he stops, he says, what about the Holocaust, right? Because the Holocaust represents among the worst instances, displays of human suffering that the human race has experienced, right? It's the symbol of the worst that humanity can suffer. What went through my mind when he asked me that was what I've been saying to you in general, that the future decides. The future decides if it ever occurred and has power to reverse it. Well, I wasn't going to say that because I thought I'd be thrown out of the room as a Holocaust denier. But it's the philosophical reality, even of the Holocaust. The future decides the past and can change anything in the past if the future takes a sufficiently different direction from what we've expected. So that's what I said to the rabbi. I said, the future decides if it ever occurred and has power to reverse it. I didn't know what to expect, and he was silent, and then he spoke. And what he said was from a direction I would never have anticipated. He said, that is what the Messiah is supposed to say. Well, if the Messiah is supposed to say that, and I don't know, then the Messiah is philosophically astute, okay? I also said to him that the world is not complete until we all become messiahs, right? The point of philosophy is it's the solution to the world is not an individual, not a personality, not that at all. The solution to the world is an understanding. It's in the nature of our concepts, the nature of the rigor of our circumstances, that's true, right? In the same way that, and I've addressed this also previously, that we can't judge, we can't assess, we can't evaluate another person's circumstances, life well enough to judge, not because God or the commandment says we can't, but because philosophically, any difference between our circumstance and another's means that we cannot rigorously know enough to be in that person's circumstances. We cannot, it's not enough to walk in their shoes. It's not enough to occupy their skin. We would have had to have been born in their skin and not even born in their skin and not born ourselves at all. Then we can judge. So the point is that it's the rigor of our circumstance that can lead to the solution to a whole range of problems, can decide what our needs are. Remember, I've mentioned that there's an aphorism I wrote, selflessness, how one acts not out of need. We don't even know the nature of our needs. And so we should first attend to our circumstances, solve our world, understand where this Eden is. And I think we're kind of running out of time and I want to take some questions. I think I want to address that soon, where this Eden is, but basically it's right here, right now, in front of our eyes. And the only thing standing between us and the recognition of that Eden is the objects we see around us. Because those objects are those are convergences. Those are not rigors. Those objects are assemblages of past experience and future expectation. You have to eliminate those from what you're seeing. And when you eliminate the past and the future from your sense of the world around you, when you see that world as if you were opening your eyes to it for the very first time, that world that you see before our mind, our brain organizes it into concepts, that represents the landscape and the rigor of Eden. It's right here, right now, as Thoreau intuited, as Voltaire was suggesting. Okay, we have some questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much for this wonderful speech. Like, it's very interesting, but at the same time, it's a bit complicated. So,
Okay.
like this topic, we should talk about it more.
Okay.
Here is a question from Kwanish Sawatov, who here is the comment and then the question. I quote. An atheist once asked Muslim, "How will you feel if you died and discovered the hereafter was a lie?" To that, Muslim replied, "Not worse than if I died and discovered the hereafter is the truth." So Kwanish is asking, I'd like to hear your opinion on it. And do you admit that a religious person has advantage as insurance because of religion in comparison with disbeliever?
Okay, the best response and the philosophic response, to this question of death and what comes next. Now, obviously, philosophically, we don't know, right? But and we suffer our expectations, what we think is true of it. And I think I gave you once kind of that philosophical joke by one of the early philosophers who came before Socrates. His name is Thales. Thales once said, "Life is no different than death." And someone said to him, "Then why don't you die?" And Thales responded, "Because it makes no difference. They're the same." Which is actually the response that the Christian Michelangelo had to death. The idea that this world was created by the hand of God. Anything that comes after this world is created by the hand of God. The hand of God is likely to do as good a job on what comes after as he has done here. That's Michelangelo's kind of Christian response. But the more I find philosophic response, the more satisfactory response is Confucius's response. He was asked the nature of death, and his response was, one world at a time. So the point is that our responsibility is to deal with this as it presents itself. And the simple fact is, we know nothing of death. We know nothing of the moment to come. The moment to come is equivalent to the moment of death. And in terms of like possibilities, let's say, like one of my aphorisms is, there is no death. The world can end at any time or at different times for different people. So the point is, we do lots of projecting, we make lots of claims, lots of assumptions, we have lots of ideas about things. The philosophic approach is to remove all the belief, remove all the ideas, and where you end up is something stronger than any picture we have of death. It's something that is actually what mystics discuss when they talk about mystical union with God, becoming one with God, becoming where that's the complete solution. So philosophically, I think that's more likely to be, a condition rather than one where sort of at a distance from the things around us. But what I want to deal with at some point soon is this notion of the objects we see standing between us and the solution to the world. That the solution to the world, this reality that has the full embodiment of Eden, that represents that mystical union with God, that complete solution is right here, right now, if we can only learn to see through the objects, or not to see the objects, but to see what's present before they become organized by our brain into objects. That is the form of the final reality or the final solution. But again, the philosophical response that I like as much as any is the Confucian one. One world at a time. Deal with this, address this, solve this, come to terms with this in a satisfactory way. And that is likely to be as compelling a solution as any. But even if there's like something after this, and even if there's some new set of circumstances. Remember, I've said that's part of what it means that the future decides the past. That we can awaken to a new set of circumstances after we die, and then beyond that we can awaken to a new set of circumstances. So it's only at the end of time that things are finally sort of settled. Until then, it remains a set of possibilities. Is that? But again, I recommend Confucius. One world at a time. Address this. And the philosophic response, I think, is stronger than the religious response in the sense that, again, death is on a par with the moment to come, and that Buddhist end of concepts. You know, when in Buddhist writing, you know, when people talk about death, you know, the answer is always, there is no death, nor is there not no death. The concepts vanish.
No, cool. And I very much like the quote about there is no difference between life and death. So, and it is like giving us the sense of living right now, like we are experiencing now at this right moment.
We have to come to terms with this right here, right now, and then deal with whatever might come next. But this is the one thing that we know with certainty. This right here, right now, and any solution has to be present right here, right now. If we just understand it correctly, if we just see it in the right way. And we know we're not seeing things around us well because in general, we can't draw well. So we're not really seeing what's in front of our eyes. In fact, when we draw, most people draw as children draw. They draw stick figures. They'll draw, you know, a face as a circle or an oval and arms, you know, as kind of lines. Well, that's not drawing what you're seeing. That's drawing your concept of what you're seeing. And it's the concept that Buddhism and Christianity and philosophy are trying to move beyond.
Yes, but sometimes not. But most of the people, they do not understand this, like this idea of living now. So how to persuade or how to explain to them that we should not worry about like the future or what had already passed, like how to make other people to believe, to make them live in the right this moment.
Well, yes, it's an exercise, but one of the ways I sort of suggest or introduce the exercise is like, okay, like to my left, there's a wall, right? Well, what I don't know at the moment is what's going on the other side of that wall, right? Now, I assume that what's on the other side of that wall is what was there the last time I saw it. That's an assumption. That's not rigorous. Like part of moving into the space of certainty, you know, what you can absolutely know for sure is to sort of realize that what is outside the walls that you're now seeing can in principle take any possible form. So you have to like imagine that since you're not experiencing it, you can say whatever you like about it. That you're saying it's the same as it was the last time I saw it, that's an assumption. You don't know that. Now, philosophy, by demanding rigor, is demanding that you stop thinking in those terms. Now, you also have to start getting accustomed to the fact that, like, again, if you believe in a God, or if you embrace philosophy, or if you believe in science, you don't know what this chair is going to do in the next instant. You don't know what any of these objects around you are going to do in the next instant. You have to start thinking in terms of what your confidence in the world around you is, your expectation of that world based upon your past experience and how your brain is sort of simplifying experience. So you have to start thinking in terms of almost the way you might think in terms of a cartoon, you know, or of a comic or something, where this object or this imagine like in a movie like The Matrix, where you peel away the wall and what's behind it is something completely different. Those are the kind of sort of experiments you need to do mentally, that any of these things can do anything, including disappear. In fact, there's a horror story, a very short story about a child who wakes up one morning. She's like a 12-year-old child, and she's missing a toe. And she's all, terrified, and she goes to her mother, and they take her to the doctor. And then the next day, she's missing another toe, and another toe, day after day after day after day. And so finally, 10 years later, she's lost all her toes, and she's relieved because it's over. At least the process of the horror is over. And then the next day, she goes to sleep, wakes up, and she's missing a finger. Right? I mean, that's the horror of the possibility that we don't know what's going to happen next. Like one way to create a movie, maybe it's a horror story, maybe it's a different kind, a magical film, is to have the objects in our environment just disappear. In fact, here's like when we lose something, we normally find it, right? If we lose keys, we lose a book, we lose, a sock or something, typically, eventually, we'll find it, okay? Well, just imagine that this world was such that whenever you lost something, you never, ever found it, ever. No matter what it was, that will change your whole sense of the world, in the sense that you can't rely upon the objects that you rely upon simply because the past has taken a certain direction. So these are the kind of like exercises you have to do. You have to kind of imagine, all different things. But like I gave that story, whether that famous question, a tree falls in the forest, there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, the fact is, if there's no one there to hear it, you can say whatever you like about it, because there's no one there and there will never have been anyone there. So what you say you can say it, so far as you know, when you turn your back on, there's that child's game, peekaboo, where you kind of close the child's eyes or something, and the child thinks the world disappears. You have to take that game seriously. So far as you know, when you close your eyes, the world disappears. So far as you can ever know. You have to think. I have some aphorisms about that. A child's game reveals the nature of our circumstances. The world behind our back that we're not experiencing right now can take any possible form. You have to do these almost as like exercises to free you from the past, from your expectations based on the past. And remember, I gave an example, I think a few weeks ago, where the famous 20th century existentialist philosopher Sartre said that during the German occupation of France during World War II, the French were most free, more free than they had ever been, because they were free of the past. We impose these patterns, and the point is, from the rigor of so that's how we kind of move beyond, our sense. We have to do those kinds of almost exercises. Imagine, one of the best ways it illustrates it is there's a scene in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's a movie from like 1968 by Stanley Kubrick, the famous American director. 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's one of the most famous films ever made on science fiction. And there's a scene late in the film where an astronaut is traveling through like another dimension. And all of a sudden he finds himself in a bedroom. And the bedroom is in the middle of nowhere. When you're in a room, you have to imagine that room is in the middle of nowhere. In other words, it's helpful to see that movie, 2001, and see that scene And the strangeness of that scene is really the nature of our circumstance. It's that strange. And in fact, that's one of the ways that we approach Eden. We have to overcome our sense of the familiar, because the world is really much more strange than it appears. It only seems not strange because of the repetition of experience. You see, so it's a matter of doing some exercises. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And we still have some questions that our viewers would like to be answered. So maybe we're very quickly, like going back to the previous question, Kwanish also asked, like, feeling of the presence is good, but shouldn't we take into account what might wait for us hereafter?
Oh, yes. I mean, and that's part of this thinking, is that anything is possible. That, in other words, our sense, there's an aphorism I write, we suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy lets us breathe again. That the world is greater than our sense of it, because the possibilities are unbounded, no matter what. It's like everything might have been the same, more or less, until tomorrow morning. And tomorrow morning is when everything changes. It's like we think the sun is going to rise tomorrow, that, we're going to have that daily. We don't know that. The religion doesn't demand it. Science doesn't demand it. Philosophy doesn't demand it. But we kind of dull. We live a diminished, a kind of restricted sense of the world. We live less than the world, less than the reality, because we expect that it's going to take the direction that it has. We have to sort of eliminate that from our thinking. There's a line from Shakespeare's Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Well, that's not really philosophy, right? Philosophy recognizes that the possibilities are far greater than our imagining. So the greatness of our circumstance is far greater. We diminish our sense of the world with the concepts that we bring to sort of organize it. It's like we have a dull sense of the world. We're not appreciating the real possibility of things. And like I think I might have mentioned this, a line from a movie where one of the characters, a character has died and he goes to the afterlife, but he doesn't know yet what it is. And another character says to him, what do you think of this? And he responds, I don't know what this is yet. We don't know what this is yet. The reality hasn't fully formed itself yet because the future decides it. We don't yet know what this is. It's greater than our imaginings.
Interesting. Yes. We still have some questions, but I would suggest that I read it now, but okay, these questions will be answered during our next session. So we will start this session with the answering them. So please, if viewers join us next Friday at the same time. But I will read the questions first. Ansar Nadraliyev asks, I have a question. What do you think about changing a perception of philosophy of the people? Since some people say that philosophy is not necessary for our society. I don't agree with them. And there is a question.
That's a great question that I'm going to talk a lot about. Yes.
So what do you think about Martin Heidegger?
Okay. I'll talk about that. He's not one of my favorite philosophers, but I'll talk about him. Yes.
And another question from Kwanish. Philosophy teaches us common sense, and religion says restrain yourself from vices. And the greatest things comes from right living. So do you think the people can live fulfilled life without ethics?
Okay, I will talk about that. That's another good question. Yes. We have an excellent sort of way to deal with that question. Yes.
That's right. Thank you very much, dear participants and viewers, for these great questions. So stay tuned. Please join our next session so you will know the answers. And we will announce the topic of the next week. So please stay tuned and prepare your questions in beforehand. You also can leave comments in our social networks or in the next visuals, next posters. If you have any questions, please address us directly via private messages in our social media as well. And Mr. Friedman, thank you so much for this wonderful talk today. The topic was very, very interesting, and we learned definitely a lot. So, guys, have a nice day. Goodbye. See you next week.